So the other thing that I asked each of them to do was to deliver to me a draft consensus statement, which we then sort of fused together into a Frankenstein monster of a general consensus statement, and all of the guys had to sign off on this. And here it is. Strength training and continuous endurance training make different demands on muscle energy systems, produce different fuel utilization profiles, and activate divergent and probably competitive cell signaling and genetic responses. These signaling and genetic responses promote distinct adaptations. Strength training produces a hypertrophic muscle phenotype geared towards high force production, comprehensive fiber recruitment, and high anaerobic capacity. Endurance training produces a non-hypertrophic oxidative muscle phenotype geared towards sustained but moderate force production without comprehensive fiber recruitment. HIIT and similar protocols impose a comprehensive stress across energy systems and fuel utilization profiles. HIIT produces a mixed bioenergetic muscle phenotype with improvements in both aerobic and anaerobic power, with probable improvements in fiber recruitment and minimal improvements in force production and hypertrophy. Strength training induces positive aerobic or endurance adaptations in sedentary, elderly, or deconditioned subjects without the addition of a conditioning component. More fit and conditioned trainees will observe negligible improvements with strength training alone, as their aerobic capacity is already advanced beyond the point where strength training alone can drive further aerobic adaptations. Both strength training and continuous endurance training produce cardiac ventricular remodeling with modest improvements in performance. The data on arterial stiffness with strength training in the literature is highly mixed, but both forms of exercise appear to promote healthy improvements in vascular physiology and health, with reductions in resting heart rate and blood pressure. There is no compelling data that strength training produces a clinically significant decline in arterial compliance or pathologic sequelae. Continuous endurance training interferes with strength adaptations, but strength training interferes only minimally, if at all, with aerobic adaptations. Strength training consistently improves endurance sport performance, likely through improvements in anaerobic metabolism, force production, and movement economy. Sequential training appears to be more effective than combined training. HIIT alone, even using the sport movements, is ineffective at improving strength in already strong populations. Trainees attempting to improve body composition while maximizing or maintaining strength gain should incorporate conditioning work, which minimizes eccentric damage, especially in target muscle groups, leaving a day's separation between aerobic and strength training sessions. There is suggestive but not definitive evidence that HIIT is a superior option for concurrent conditioning. Endurance/aerobic athletes using concurrent strength training should focus on infrequent, 2 or 3 times weekly, heavy weight work with some explosive movements. In such cases, strength gains will be relatively small and slow. Weight gain will need to be restricted to accommodate sporting demands. If HIIT is to be used concurrently with strength training, consideration must be given to the total amount of fatigue generated, because HIIT has the potential to be more fatiguing than low-intensity steady-state work. HIIT incorporation must be managed carefully so as to minimize subsequent decrements in strength training performance. So we're going to have a brief panel discussion, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A.
So stupid YouTube comment would probably be, so you're trying to tell me that starting strength will make me an Olympic 5K runner. You're trying to tell me that all you need to do is get strong and you'll run super fast. And obviously the answer to that not only doesn't fit the physiology, it doesn't fit the evidence, and it's not what we're saying. That the conditioning component, the actual sport component of endurance performance, is obviously critical. That has to be there. But as you get better and better and better at your sport, you need to find more and more ways to squeeze out what we can. And there are adaptations waiting in resistance training to improve and drive further increases in speed that most people aren't tapping into right now because they're afraid of getting too huge.
Okay, I think Austin Baraki is constitutionally incapable of saying something stupid, but I'm going to ask him to come up with a stupid YouTube comment and address it anyway.
Okay. I think it would be something along the lines of, so how come the Olympic medalist in the marathon this past year, why shouldn't he be drinking a gallon of milk a day? Or something along those lines.
Why doesn't he squat 4 or 5?
Yeah. Doesn't. So let me guess. Rip is going to say that this guy should be drinking a gallon of milk a day so he can go and win the Olympic marathon. And this is a typical situation where you're not listening to the arguments here. And so I hope that at the end of this, we have our consensus statement that's put out in a very condensed and accessible way. It itself is already condensed, but very accessible way, because if you read the consensus statement carefully, sentence by sentence, there's very little to argue with there, at least from the standpoint of what we saw in the evidence. And we don't come close to saying that you need to gain 100 pounds and get your squat to 500 to go win an endurance performance-based event, as is typically construed about our position. So yeah, I would just say read the consensus statement carefully, because that's not what we're saying.
Well, I could imagine something along the lines of, what do these guys know? They don't even run. And, you know.
Well, there you got us there.
And
you got us there.
My answer would be, you're right. We don't run. So, but that doesn't that didn't stop us from trying to take a really objective look at the literature as a whole. And I think, like Austin said, if you get back to the consensus statement and you kind of take a look at the literature that was cited by CJ, I think we were really fair in our approach here, and we're not trying to pick on any one particular study. We're trying to point out, where some of the shortcomings are, and how can we maybe address that in a more practical sense.
So, given what you guys have seen in the literature, I mean, you guys have really drilled deep into this literature on resistance training, endurance training, the interaction between the two, the potential role of HIIT. Is there anything about our general model of training that you think requires some modification or qualification or change going forward? Is this going to have any impact on the way that you train or the way you train your clients going forward?
So, for me, it's more a question of what clients would I get. So if I am getting that client who is I am an aerobic athlete, I'm an endurance athlete looking for strength to improve, because this word is getting out and people are starting to look at it now, to improve, and they will not do a sequenced, first just back off and do the linear progression. I think that the literature is such, and my experience as a coach is such, that I can still help them and support them in making strength gains, understanding the limitations and the compromises therein. I think there's plenty of evidence from what we've seen that it's suboptimal, but it still could be done.
Austin?
Yeah, I agree with that, and think that we pointed out specifically some things that have been laid out in the evidence in terms of how you can best mitigate the interference effect, which is something that is probably a particularly practical thing to take away from this, in terms of if you have a trainee who would benefit from doing both modes of training, how you can best minimize the interference. Because we get asked this stuff all the time, right? They're going to say, well, I want to get really strong, but I also want to be super conditioned. And we know that that's not a realistic thing, but we have ways that we can say, all right, well, I can set you up with this style of programming that, based on what we know, will be the most effective way to minimize the interference between them. So I think that's...
And why don't you just go ahead and summarize some of those ways for us real quick? I know we talked about them in the review, but let's talk about it.
Yeah, so the ones that CJ summarized at the end there included using modes of conditioning that minimize eccentric muscle damage, which I think most of us are familiar with when we talk about using modes of conditioning like hopping on a bike or using the prowler sled, things like that. Keeping the duration and the total volume of it. That was one of the studies that CJ pointed out, where when the volume and what started going over 30 minutes in a session, you started to get increased apparent interference effect, as well as the frequency, where they started to see more of it when you went over 2 sessions a week of that, as well as proximity to the strength training stimulus that you're delivering. Now, of course, something else to keep in mind is that our whole model is built on the concept of stress, recovery, and adaptation, and so you'll adapt to essentially anything. So I would imagine if someone did a trial on our style of programming strength and conditioning simultaneously over time, I would expect that you might see, if there was a good way to quantify the interference effect between the two, that might actually diminish over time because you're adapting to both stresses that you're delivering to somebody. But when you're getting somebody started out on it, those would be some good ways to, oh, and did I mention keeping it separated from your, from your strength stimulus by, at least,
time.
yeah, over 12 hours, which is kind of silly. You're not going to do it necessarily have these regular Joes coming in for 2 a day. So 24 hours is a convenient way. Just have them do it the next day. Separated. So those are ways you can practically program these sorts of things to have people minimize the interference effect and get the best results that they can get as far as we know based on the evidence right now.
One of the things that we see all the time on the forum, in comments on the interwebs, is well, you're engaged in strength training, but you're not doing any LSD type aerobic endurance training, so you're leaving your cardiovascular health and function behind. And what kind of leapt out of John's review is, first of all, the adaptations are not all that dissimilar, and both forms of training actually optimize to some degree cardiovascular performance. Wouldn't you agree with that, John? I mean, how would you answer that objection going forward? You're doing resistance training, so you're going to have a bunch of stiff arteries and an overstiff ventricle, and you're going to be cardiovascular unhealthy going forward. How would you address that in the future going forward?
I think that that type of assumption is just, when you look at the literature, it's just untrue. Like you said, the adaptations are more similar than we previously had thought, whereas we thought that the ventricular remodeling and the effect on arterial compliance was very divergent. That's actually not the case. And I think, kind of getting back to our approach, I think that our approach and emphasis on developing a good base of strength first is supported by this stuff, that you're not going to have any sort of negative consequences in terms of aerobic adaptation or cardiovascular adaptation by spending some time developing a good base of strength to work off of, and then going forward in the future, if you are, let's say, an endurance athlete or get involved in those sorts of activities, right, or you're an unhealthy, person with a high BMI, obesity, that sort of thing. Having a good base of strength to work off of is going to make you better over the long term at those things than you would be without it. So I think that really is kind of the result of what we looked at.
One of the simple formulas that you see people talk about going forward is like, general population, lift weights, and do your high intensity interval training for general population as a general fitness program, and for athletes, lift weights and play your sport. Lift weights and play and practice your sport. What do you guys think about that, based on what you've been looking at the last several months?
So in terms of like when people start giving out general guidelines for what the
And all the usual caveats apply.
Yeah, of course. One thing that always strikes me is that they see a difference between strength and health. Like there's a performance component that we get stronger because we want to. We get stronger because we like being stronger. We like being bigger. And then there's a health component that we need stronger hearts. And you see it in even some of the biggest names in the literature. You see in Brooks and Fahey when he talks about VO2 max is the most important indicator of cardiovascular health. If I remember correctly, it's almost just the most important indicator. I think we forget how important strength is, and this has come up in previous years' reviews. How important strength is for health, how important strength is for motility and quality of life going into late life, and the benefits and the facility of doing them sequentially that outweigh any simplistic kind of, well, just do this. Just considering how important strength and muscle mass are, it strikes me as odd, or it strikes me as simplistic enough to say, get that first. Especially since aerobic interferes with strength in a way that strength doesn't interfere with aerobic training.
Austin, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think our general recommendations are reasonably good for general population people, but but they're, as I said, intended to be general. And so when you all are working with individuals, they're going to be different people, different starting capacities where they're working from, things like that. So let's say you're starting with somebody who you do feel the need to incorporate some conditioning with them. Our general guideline is suggesting that they do some high-intensity interval work, but if you'll recall, Sully put up his spectrum, and some people are really far down that line of general suckitude, and that is going to be that could potentially be a problem, both from an adherence standpoint, from them wanting to come back and keep training, from a fatigue standpoint, things like that that you might need to keep in mind. And so there might be situations where you'll need to be flexible with somebody and say, even though my guideline says that doing some of this interval conditioning is kind of a more time-efficient approach for this particular person, their situation, their mental fortitude, whatever the case is, I might need to do more of this, LSD stuff that we talk about. But fortunately, I've now been equipped with these tools that I know in terms of how to best apply it to minimize the interference with the strength work that we're doing with them.
John?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think one of the things that I took away from the review was that even though in theory it would appear that the high-intensity interval training really comports more with what we would like to do from a resistance training standpoint, we can get away with doing, the more traditional endurance type stuff if we follow some of those guidelines in terms of frequency, in terms of duration, and in terms of modality, especially, the eccentric stress. And, if you have a client that is going to be more compliant in doing that sort of thing, then, the negative consequences may not be as severe as we had, previously thought.
That all being said, it's important to point out that Gabala's group and others have looked into sort of less high-intensity interval training, some other protocols that seem to have a similar effect, but are not going to have that intensity of suckage factor that the classic HIIT does. So there are actually a range of opportunities with HIIT as well, and I think that's important to point out. Any last things that any of you would like to add before we open it up for the Q&A? CJ?
There was one thing, and I wasn't really sure how to get in the presentation. And it's something we all kind of know. It's built in as part of the model. The idea of sequential training, one after the other. It tends to be built into the literature. For instance, that a highly trained aerobic athlete introducing strength training has a lot less impact on their aerobic performance, a lot less negative impact, virtually nil, than a novice runner who is just starting their 5K program because they are not as adapted to the fatigue. The same thing goes with a higher level strength athlete. If you take we see this in CrossFit all the time. You take a high level, football player or, somebody who has this incredible work capacity and strength. They've already got the 500 plus pound deadlift, the 315 plus pound clean and jerk. And then you go, okay, you're going to start doing some runs and swims and get your conditioning up to pace. They can hold a lot better starting from that high base of strength than they could have, and we know because nobody puts in that kind of conditioning as a novice and gets to that 315 clean and jerk, that 500 pound deadlift. That idea of a ladder training, that we don't climb up a ladder by throwing both hands and both feet up and trying to jump up that way, but we raise our capacity in one and then meet it, raise our capacity in one and then meet it, makes more sense in the long term and helps and is not just in terms of short-term mitigation of the interference effect, but in the long-term lifetime of a program way to mitigate interference.
Austin, any final remarks?
Nope.
John?
No, I'm good.
All right, we're going to open it up to questions for a few minutes.
Couple of observations. First,
Of course you do.
of course, because that's my job. First, isn't it astonishing how bad the literature is? Isn't it astonishing the limitations it places on our ability to actually draw useful conclusions?
I was very disappointed by how many times I saw a study that I really wanted to be true, and you can't draw any conclusions from it.
Because it's so badly done, and here, and this is the accumulated effort of 50 years, and it hadn't improved. And it's just interesting to me that entire careers not just careers, but retirements, have been built on top of this mound of doo-doo. And it's
The real big gaposis here is between the way strength training is done in the laboratory and the way strength training is done in the real world. And not just by starting strength coaches either, by any strength and conditioning coach who knows what he's doing. It just doesn't look like what's being studied in the laboratory and physiology departments. And I think that's an area where we can have an impact, like what the presentation that John Patrizio gave us yesterday. So that's the real big gaposis, because when we look at this literature, that's what we see over and over again, is a huge difference between the way strength training protocols are conducted in the laboratory versus how they're done in the real world. And second observation.
Second observation is, no matter what the literature says, no matter what we say, no matter what goes on in the real world, the medical community remains wedded to the idea that health equals long, slow distance. And that if you are not engaging in some type of exercise that is measured in minutes, then you are not healthy. And that you must engage in an exercise that is measured in minutes in order to be healthy. I'm not talking about from a performance standpoint. I'm talking about from a health standpoint. What changes that perception?
Well, I would
Can
have,
it be changed?
I would have two things to say about that. The first is that I think that is changing. Recently, I got my first prescription from a primary care physician. I got a prescription saying, strength training twice a week for one of my new clients, from an MD, from a physician. The literature is accumulating on this topic, and we like to say that surgeons, even surgeons, eventually start to comply with their own literature. It just takes 20 years. So part of it is it's taking time, but there is an accumulating body of evidence on the role of strength training for health and for healthy aging, and so I think it's starting to break down. Do you guys have anything to say about this?
I actually would agree with that. I do think it's starting to change. I don't think that it's as, that thought process is as pervasive as it was even just 10 years ago. There are more articles being written in mainstream media, some of them by physicians, about the value of strength training, about the value of high-intensity interval training. So I do think that that's changing, but it's going to take time.
Yeah, there are some official society recommendations, guidelines that are coming through the pipeline now, basically meant for primary care physicians in order to guide them in how to counsel their patients. And they recommend resistance training as well as some aerobic type activity, which we would, based on what we've presented here today, we would agree with. But the bigger issue there is that both, one, most of these physicians who might be reading these guidelines, or more likely not reading them, don't really know what it means when it says to recommend resistance training. What do we mean by that? What is that intervention that I should be telling a patient, or how do I tell them how to do this? And even more likely, I don't have enough time to tell them how to do this when I'm seeing them. And then the other thing is that obviously most of them don't have experience themselves doing it. We have seen, myself included, that when you do it yourself and you realize the benefits yourself, you're more likely to go out and get people on board. And so that's something that, I personally, I know me and Jordan are working together on this stuff to kind of disseminate this a little further among physicians in particular, to hope to have a broader impact from that standpoint. Because at this point, the data, the evidence, the literature is all there, the guidelines are there, people just need to put them into practice. But it's hard to get a doctor to recommend something to a patient when they have, it's like telling a doctor, hey, here's this brand new medicine, just showed up on the market, I want you to start prescribing it to all your patients. They're gonna be like, oh, hell no, I don't know anything about that, I don't know what the risks are, any of this stuff. And so it's a matter of leading them to where the literature is, the data showing that it's safe, it's effective, here's how you do it, and you should do it yourself.
What we need is like what the drug reps have. We need a pretty girl in a little black dress with high heels and lots of free food
Yeah.
to go around and
Just a
like
bombshell who
recommend
can
this-
squat 315
Right,
coming in
recommend
the
this
office.
resistance training medicine, then they'll prescribe it. Yeah,
One thing I just want to add to that, though, is so, you know, it's nice to have physicians that recommend resistance training, but you see this all the time where they can actually do more harm than good by saying, well,
low weight, high reps.
right, do
Right.
resistance training, but don't lift heavy weights. Or, you know, I've had patients, they go back to their doctor and they say, oh, you know, I've been doing deadlifts. Well, don't do deadlifts because that's gonna, you know, you're gonna destroy your back and things like that. So, you know, the lack of practical experience is really detrimental, and can have a negative impact in terms of our ability to, you know, kind of get our message out there.
Both in the medicine and in the research, I think, and they've outlined it, like, the problem is the prescription. In the research and concurrent training, one thing that comes up that's so challenging, how do you volume match a 5K run with resistance training? Like, does a starting strength A day, you know, 3x5s and 1x5, is that equivalent to a 5K? How do you know? So how do you effort match that? In the same way, how do you as a doctor effort match, you know, the two, like some of the protocols that you see in the literature as whether they're effective or not? So in that sense, I think it will always be harder to prescribe resistance training, but at the very least, I think you see at least the general intention moving towards, well, this thing is important. We don't know what it is.
Right.
You know, we don't know necessarily how to prescribe it, and it's going to follow the same tendencies of just do it. But I think at the very least, the intention is there.
Because for the most part, when doctors prescribe any sort of exercise, they're not actually prescribing it. They're just saying, get some exercise. There's no specification of the actual formulation of the exercise medicine, its route of administration, its dosage, its frequency, its therapeutic targets, because they don't really think of exercise, despite all the talk about exercise being medicine. Doctors don't really treat it like a medicine. They don't really treat it like something that they have to prescribe. Just get some exercise. Stop smoking and get some exercise.
And for that, the onus is going to have to be on the patient.
Right. So,
Yikes.
so we still have a lot of work to do.
The YouTube commentary.
Jordan Feigenbaum, MD, SSC.
I have a few questions and then just kind of like discussion points. So the first is, CJ, you talked a lot about VO2 max, and this is more like a statement and then a question. So VO2 max, there's been quite a bit of data suggesting there's a minimum threshold for maximum mortality benefit from VO2 max development. It's been estimated right at that 40 to 45 range, which can be attainable through resistance training for a large cohort, but certainly not all folks. That also being said, the new trend is to use metabolic equivalents. Each med is worth about 3.5 on that score. So if you can voluntarily elevate your meds to over 8, you don't fall off the survival curve. You effectively maxed out what you need for conditioning.
Survival benefit.
Yeah, exactly. So my question, in your readings, did you run across any sort of evidence how quickly people's VO2 max or metabolic equivalents improve during resistance training based in the literature?
So this was, and I would call this not contrary to the hypothesis, but contrary to my bias. I assumed that resistance training would have a demonstrable positive effect in most populations, at least to some small degree. We see on the forums people talking about, oh, I had a heart rate monitor, my average heart rate over a starting strength session was 140 beats per minute. How could this not be somehow an aerobic stimulus that improves VO2 max? But consistently throughout the literature, at least VO2 max was not improving by virtually any. And in fact, in some of the meta-analysis and reviews, even showing a non-statistical decrease.
Yeah.
So in terms of activity level, in maintaining that 8 MET performance for minimum sustainable to not die, just from practical application of strength programs, I would expect that is met. I did not see it in the literature.
Right. So my interpretation of the studies would be that the people going through that resistance training protocol had already met that VO2 max
Yes.
minimum, and
Yes.
therefore they're not improving because they're not low enough to improve from.
Yeah, and that's the consensus that we all
Right.
saw. So if you're a couch potato and you have a shit VO2 max, like you're coming up with 20, right, and you just do the program.
Walk into the gym.
Right, you just walk into the gym, right?
Just the walking.
You're going to improve your VO2 max. So, but I think what we're talking about here and what you're talking about here is when we see these studies where we don't see an improvement in VO2 max, even though the trainee clearly gets more fit, what we're seeing is not a limitation of resistance training. What we're seeing is a limitation of that particular metric. That's what we're seeing.
Not sensitive enough to pick up
Exactly.
improvement in fitness.
Exactly.
Which is why the new thing is METS.
Is looking at METs, which is what which is what the cardiologist has been looking at forever with stress testing and so forth.
My second kind of question point discussion today was about the concurrent training. So we've had this idea that we should separate resistance training and conditioning by at least 12 hours to mitigate any sort of interference effect. But would you agree that the studies that you're able to review, the sample sizes are low and then the follow-up is short, and then also the actual training is...
So it's in. It was on the slide. Though I may not have spoken to it. Part of the problem. So SPORE, actually, I think that study was well done. That found that there was no interference 1-for-1. But when you looked at the concurrent training models, very few of them actually violated that principle in how they were designed, and yet they still showed an interference effect. Although there may not be an immediate impact in terms of how much volume you can accomplish on the squat and on the bench press, for instance, after an aerobic session, if you space it out enough, it seems like there's still an interference over days and weeks and over months of a program, like as they were talking about in their pieces on the effect at the genetic level and at the tissue level.
And so you're saying from the short follow-up type deal, you're missing an opportunity to observe adaptation and reducing interference over time. Yeah, that's what I.
Effectively what you're saying is if performance has decreased, right, then the stress has not been recovered and adapted.
I would say actually that the difference between Hickson, which was such a ridiculous protocol, and some of the ones that came after is a demonstration of that fact. When you look at layered multi-day, 2-a-day kind of work where you are hitting that interference on a daily basis, Vice split over a week training, in the fact that the daily, like Hickson's protocol, they actually got worse after a little bit, and then the others just showed slow improvement. I think that's what you see as the result.
Yeah, I actually came away from my reading of the literature with maybe a little bit more of an optimistic view about HIT and interference than perhaps CJ did. In part, this recent study by Pew in 2015, I don't know if you looked at that or not. And so I think a big difference is what's the conditioning modality? Because if you're talking about LSD and strength training, then yeah, doing those on the same day and combining that's obviously a bad idea. But if you're talking about pushing the prowler at the end of a strength training workout, I think that's an entirely different deal, and you're going to get a lot less interference from that because you're working in a similar energy system. You're working with an intermittent form of training, and I think you're going to see a lot less interference from doing that kind of conditioning work than you are from long, slow distance. Would you guys agree or disagree with that?
I think that this is all, as he suggested, and as I mentioned at the end of my little piece, limited by our short follow-ups, because even higher training volumes of whatever modality with sufficient time to follow up, you'll adapt to it. So I would expect that interference effect, even at fairly higher training volumes than we would expect, can be adapted to over time. But we're seeing an interference effect in the short term that concerns us, understandably.
Yeah. So I think what my takeaway from your presentations and then from your literature reviews is that in a untrained population, the interference effect is very, very real, and which would caution us from, again, routinely suggesting to perform additional conditioning.
Which is why a raw novice doesn't need to push the prowler.
But then later on in intermediate and further, that you would suggest, I expect your initial strength levels and performance levels to potentially decline, but then you will recover and adapt and improve.
And and we saw that in the research on powerlifters and strongman, that they continue to grow in strength through their own resistance training, but with little interference from the training that they were doing. And the same with elite aerobic athletes, introducing strength training into their program by having that strong base. They are less impacted. The stress is less unmanageable.
So you're talking about somebody who comes in and they're a novice, but they're previously active, they're athletic, so they've got a VO2 max, I hate to use the metric, of 45, right? So do we need to have them running or pushing the prowler on day one? And my answer to that would be no. Just get them strong. Don't let anything interfere with getting them strong, and then you can address their fitness or performance requirements later on, either during the late novice or early intermediate phase. That would be my approach. Guys,
I would say that someone in that situation probably, you wouldn't expect to see any increase from them only running
Not
the
a
novice,
decrease
but they
either.
wouldn't see a decrease either. So they would probably be able to maintain their fitness while they went through, the novice progression. And then after they get through that, then they start to add back in some of their other activities.
That would
I
be
think
my- that would be
the
my
best way to
approach.
do it.
I will borrow a phrase to say I have a more nuanced opinion on the matter. I think because you said specifically that they might have mixed modality goals. Yeah, and so they could potentially have a competitive season of some sort to be worried about, time frames, things like that. So you have to take their goals into account, and you kind of have to use, you kind of have to get informed consent from someone when you're starting them on this
Yeah, you have
program,
to
and
individualize.
inform them and say, like, you understand that by undertaking this program without doing conditioning work, you'll get the most strong, or if you should you choose to do so, to continue doing your mixed modality stuff, you might not get the same strength outcomes otherwise, but that might be a better idea for you right now since you have a triathlon coming up in 8 weeks or something like that. So I think it would need individualization.
Yeah, I'll be kind of like Austin. I'm going to take kind of the individual approach. I think the evidence is such that by being previously physically fit and physically active, there would be less interference and less likelihood, or it's going to be less bad. And that being considered, that it is less suboptimal, then my consideration of their compliance and their individual freakout factor is going to be a little bit more relaxed. The FIF. So if it is very important to them that they continue to do, to be able to do their CrossFit or their triathlon.
because they're going to do it anyway.
Yeah, almost because they're going to do it anyway, whatever activity it may be, then I would be less concerned and apply less pressure to be like, this is the model, this one's going to be more optimal to do it this way. And like you said, get that informed consent. As a coach, I have a little bit less, it bothers me less if they are previously active and capable.
Optimum number of conditioning sessions per week. I would say it depends. That would be my short answer.
I think you have to start low and you go from there, right? You start with one conditioning session a week and you see what happens. I mean, there's no real hard answer to that.
Quickly.
Agree.